I recently watched a newly released science fiction movie, I Am Mother. The film takes place after a massive event that wiped out all humans on Earth. Before the event, 63,000 human embryos were stored in an underground bunker. A robot takes one of these embryos and starts raising it. The story in the film is not very relevant to what I'm about to tell you. It's just that this opening scene raised some questions in my mind. I wonder what kind of people babies born in an environment completely isolated from the outside world would become in the future. If it were possible to raise these babies in such an environment without meeting any other human, how would they communicate with each other? What language would they speak amongst themselves? Of course, I am not the first person to ask these questions. In history, babies have been isolated and subjected to various experiments many times. Because these babies were prevented from communicating with the outside world through writing or speech in any language, these attempts are called language deprivation experiments. The goal is to find the source of the language we speak, and on a deeper level, to understand the fundamentals of human nature. Of course, isolating babies to understand such things is a completely unethical stance. For this reason, cultural historians like Roger Shattuck preferred to give these types of experiments another name, the forbidden experiment. In written sources, the historian Herodotus gives us the first example of the forbidden experiment. Around 600 BC, Egyptian Pharaoh Psamtik I ordered 2 newborn babies to be taken from their families and given to a shepherd. The shepherd was strictly forbidden from speaking to these babies. However, these babies developed a language among themselves, and the first word they uttered in the language they invented was bekos. This word did not exist in the Egyptian language. The word meant bread in the language of the Phrygians, who lived in Anatolia much earlier. For this reason, the Egyptians living at that time believed that the source of themselves and their language was Phrygia. About 1800 years later, in another experiment conducted by Frederick II in the 13th century, newborns taken from their families were again raised with minimal human interaction. Only their basic needs were met. They were strictly not spoken to. Do you know why? If there was a mother tongue, what language would it be for these babies? Shall I tell you their guesses? It was thought that the babies would speak Hebrew, Greek, Latin, or Arabic respectively. These are the languages of Holy Scriptures, or ancient texts. So as you can easily understand from these guesses, Frederick II's main goal was to find out what language Adam and Eve spoke. Salim Mene, who recounted all these events, does not mention what language the babies spoke, but he writes in detail about the cruelty of those who conducted these experiments on the babies. In subsequent centuries, even without experiments like these, there were other children who were naturally forced to grow up in isolation. There were feral children who grew up in nature, away from people. Because they did not come into contact with humans, they never developed the language skills we possess. This girl named Oksana, found in Ukraine, was able to communicate in the language spoken by dogs because she grew up with dogs. Children have been raised not only by dogs to this day, but also by sheep, cows, goats, bears, and even ostriches. Naturally, these babies developed behaviors like the animals they grew up with. After joining humans, even though they learned a lot, most never developed language skills. There is also a path of congenital and compulsory isolation, deafness. It has been observed that deaf children try to develop their own languages when there is no one around who knows sign language. For example, these Nicaraguan children you see did not communicate with anyone until 1980. They are congenitally isolated because they are deaf. After the Nicaraguan Revolution, they gathered them in the first school for the deaf in the country. They wanted to teach them sign language so they could express themselves better. Therefore, they gathered 100 babies who had been isolated from the outside world until then under the same roof. However, since they were no longer babies but children, they could not achieve their goal and failed to teach them sign language. Do you know what happened instead? The children invented a new sign language among themselves using hand and facial movements. This time, those who wanted to understand them called in linguists to try to decipher the new language. According to the linguists, the language the children developed was surprisingly complex and rich. In fact, sound was not necessary for communication. Communication is the common heritage of humanity. It is the inevitable result of being human. We still do not know how languages first emerged and how they evolved into their current state. But there is one thing we do know. Speaking is the most fundamental way to share the information we possess. This trigger is not just a community formed by many people coming together. Linguists believe that the most effective form of this trigger is a group that needs to share information among themselves. Therefore, we are nourished by knowledge and feel the need to share what we learn. We invented 6,300 languages just for this. Advertisement for English learners video will continue. At the beginning of the video, I told you about a movie called I Am Mother. It is the story of a child raised by a robot. The robot tries to communicate with the baby like a mother. Therefore, the robot speaks to her just like a human. The child does not need to invent a new language. She tries to learn life by talking to a robot. In one of these lessons, there is a modernized version of the trolley problem, which I detailed in a recently published video. They debate the question in the trolley problem: would you rather deliberately kill one person or 5 people? The subject goes to a really interesting place. It has always been a subject of curiosity. What would happen if you put babies somewhere and isolated them from the outside world? And many unethical experiments have been conducted on this. All of this is to find the source of what we call the mother tongue, and actually in a deeper sense to understand what it means to be human. Perhaps the way to do this is not to isolate others, but to isolate ourselves. Perhaps in this way we begin to think more, talk to the books we read, and create our own language. Starting from the title I Am Mother, we would find our own mother tongue. This language would not belong to the Phrygians who once lived in Anatolia, as the Egyptian pharaoh once guessed. It would be the language mentioned by the philosopher Immanuel Kant, referenced in the previous scene. All language is a reflection of thought, Kant once said. Thinking is the act of talking to oneself. This must be the highest level of language a human can achieve,